Imagine it. The year is 1850. The Compromise of 1850 had been bouncing around for months with little to no progress. One of the main points of contention were fugitive slaves. At this point in time, there were hundreds of enslaved people escaping to the north, and it was starting to create a weird situation for the whole institution of slavery altogether. Generally speaking, Northerners were against slavery, and that means they weren't too keen on sending a person back to endless and at times abusive servitude. The compromise really boiled down to sentiments in reference to slavery. Uh, so we were compromising with people who were anti slavery by having the California territory turned to a free state. Also, DC markets, slave trade markets, were banned. But that meant there had to be some concessions for Southerners. And really, that was from Southern plantation owners who didn't like the fact that their slaves were running away. But what really bothered these plantation owners is that after their fugitive slave made it to the North had no interest in sending them back. There was nobody in the North that was doing anything to return their property to them. Sometimes these plantation owners would either hire someone or be part of raids where they would go to these places where they believed that their property was, and they would just find anyone that they thought in these free safe haven areas such as Cass County, Michigan, and there was a raid there, and they would just take people and drag them back to the South. In fact, the Missouri Supreme Court stated that if an enslaver brought enslaved peoples to live there in a free state or any free state for a period of time, that enslaved person automatically gained their freedom just by living in a free state, even if they were brought there by their enslaver. This will come back, though, later on through Dred Scott. That perhaps was one of the reasons why the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 got even stricter. The general gist of the bill was to enforce the return of fugitive slaves. But here's more of the fine print. Number one, everyone has to help. Federal marshals, judges, and even everyday citizens were required to aid in the capture of fugitive slaves. And that didn't matter if it went against your personal beliefs or the state laws in which you lived. Number two, no due process. No captured fugitive slave was allowed to defend themselves or stand trial. Number three, obstruction penalties. If you helped in any way a fugitive slave, then you were subjected to fines or even imprisonment. As you can imagine, the act didn't go over particularly well. If anything, it added more fuel to an already tense fire between the North and the South. Unsurprisingly, things got violent. On September 11th, 1851, in Christina, Pennsylvania, a group of armed black men and women fought off successfully a slaveholder who had come there to gather his runaway slaves. Four people who he was trying to take back to Maryland actually ended up escaping and continuing their freedom journey all the way to Canada. On the other hand, the group that defended them were arrested because the slaveholder actually died from his injuries of the fight. Abolitionist Congressman Thaddeus Stevens defended the group, and they were set free. It was a major win for the North. Unsurprisingly, traffic on the Underground Railroad increased. Activism and resistance also increased in the North. Now you have a situation where 9 states are passing these personal liberty laws, which protects enslaved people who had run there from the South. It also makes state officials uncooperative with federal officials who were there to collect these runaway slaves. Enforced or not, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a major contributing factor to the Civil War. It's important to say 1850 because This wasn't the first law of its kind. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 had largely been ignored by Northerners since its inception, but it did differ on versus the 1850 version in a few ways. The first is the 1793 version relied on state and local governments to capture slaves to send back. Also, the penalties for helping out a fugitive slave were much harsher in the 1850 version. By November, Vermont had made a law that loopholed around making the federal law unenforceable. President Fillmore then threatened Vermont with the army in order to enforce the law, but they never acted on it. 5 years later, Wisconsin became the first state whose Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional. That same year, Michigan passed a law that prohibited slave catchers from using the local county jail in their capturing process. The list goes on with the states taking action against this law. And in fact, Uncle Tom's Cabin was written in response to this fugitive law. Abolitionist Reverend Luther Lee said of the law, "I would never obey it. I had assisted 30 slaves to escape to Canada during the last month. If the authorities wanted anything of me, my residence was at 39 Onondaga Street. I would admit that, and they could take me and lock me up in the penitentiary on the hill. But if they did such a foolish thing as that, I would have friends enough in Onondaga County to level it to the ground before the next morning." One of the unintended consequences of the law was Canada. By this point, nearly 4,000 fugitive slaves had escaped to our northern neighbor, many of whom got there through the Underground Railroad. By the time the Civil War started in 1861, there was no policy on how to continue enforcing, or not, the Fugitive Slave Act. Some of the Union leaders were continuing to return enslaved people, but many more, such as Benjamin Butler, were not. In their eyes, we're at war with the Confederacy. Why would we do something that was going to be turned around in their favor? That same year, the Confiscation Act of 1861 passed, and it basically said that no enslavers were able to capture their former slaves and bring them back and technically use them for the Confederate cause. Really specifically, they didn't want to these enslavers to grab their former enslaved people and enlist them in the army, basically. The Fugitive Slave Act itself wasn't repealed until 1864. The New York Tribune wrote of the appeal, "The blood-red stain that has blotted the statute book of the Republic is wiped out forever."